On this edition of Independent Sources, Minor Infractions, New York City provides legal assistance to the surging wave of undocumented immigrant children entering the country.
In New York City, on the ground, we've really been very fortunate, and the judges and the administration of the court has really shown that they want to make sure that these kids' rights are protected and that they have access to the information and the resources that they're entitled to.
And Talk of the Town, a project to map the city's many languages along its subway lines.
What I see happening is that there's, a lot of English in the middle, and then the English just falls right off at either end, and all of the other languages start coming up.
Those stories and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. The stories of the exodus of thousands of unaccompanied children fleeing crime and poverty in Central America made plenty of headlines over the summer. It's estimated that more than 60,000 children will cross into the U.S. by the end of the year. Saying it's been a hard road for them may be an understatement or perhaps a bad pun. And now that's been worsened by a shifting immigration policy that's trying to deport them as quickly as they arrive. But that's on the federal level. Locally, New York City is providing these children with legal assistance and opportunity to stay in the U.S. I spoke with Camille Mackler, Director of Legal Initiatives at the New York Immigration Coalition, about how they're helping these unaccompanied minors. Camille, this notion of rocket docket or trying these cases real quickly, where did that come from and why?
When we first started realizing that these numbers were really hitting surge proportions and high levels, a lot of pressure was put on the Obama administration. A lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment, a lot of the more conservative groups who were pushing back, a lot of pressure was put to send these kids back. We heard a lot of very violent rhetoric. And I think that this was in some ways the Obama administration's attempt to send a message to the families back home that they should not be letting their children go on this very dangerous voyage. Unfortunately, it ignores the fact that these children are not coming as immigrants, they're coming as refugees. They're not looking for opportunities, they're looking to save their lives. So.
And how many were we seeing at the peak, and how many cases are we seeing now?
We are still in court because of the delayed effect of, we hear from the numbers that are coming at the border, but it takes time for that child to be transferred to New York and then to be placed in removal proceedings. And right now we are seeing up to 130 children a day go through immigration court proceedings in New York. They're still coming. We've heard that numbers may be slowing down, but they are absolutely still coming, yes.
Now, how do you rapidly process a case? I mean, how has that been done?
So the rule that the Obama administration has put in place is that all these children must see a judge within 21 days of their case being filed with the court, of the case being initiated with the court. And then initially they were saying that if they wanted more time, for example, to find a lawyer, that they would have to come back in about 6 weeks or so. In practice in New York City, while we have seen that 21-day time frame, the judges have all told them that, if they need to come back, get more time, find a lawyer, et cetera, that they're giving them on average 3 to 4 months.
So who are their attorneys? Who's paying for these legal fees and all of that?
So some of the children, the families will go out and hire their own attorneys, as we've always seen in immigration court, because of course there's a right to a lawyer in immigration court, just not a right to a free lawyer. There's only a right to a lawyer at no expense to the government. Others have been able to get representation through nonprofit organizations that are specifically funded by and large by private funders also, although, for example, out in California, the state has been trying to get some money together to fund lawyers. We haven't seen that in New York yet, although we're still hopeful. And these organizations that have been handling these cases, honestly, for about 10 years. This issue of unaccompanied minors is not a new one. And there have been 5 specific organizations in New York that have been handling these cases in the immigration court here in New York City for about 10 years, and they really came together and made sure that these children did not have to face the court alone. And they brought in volunteer lawyers, they brought in other organizations, nonprofits that provide legal services either for free or for low cost.
What role, if any, has the New York Immigration Coalition been playing in this issue?
As soon as we really realized what was going on, we started bringing together stakeholders around the state and convening. First, we brought together a working group to try to help us address the issues and think through the issues. We identified 4 key needs that these children will face: legal, first and foremost; educational, second, they need to be enrolled in school; health, especially mental health, is a key need for these children; and social issues, because we need to make sure that they're integrated into our communities. And then we started hosting needs tables, bringing in all of these sort of experts in this field and all of those who had either the willingness or the knowledge to help. And this was state officials, city officials, nonprofit organizations, basically, even from more non-traditional sectors. For example, we've had a lot of input from the pediatric community in New York City because of the health issues, and starting to think through how we can collaborate, strengthen the systems, and match these children to the services that they're eligible for. In many instances, the services, particularly in New York City, but all throughout the state, the services exist. We just need to make sure that we are connecting these children to those services, and that's what the role that we at the NYC have really been trying to play.
Now, there's an interesting paradox. The federal government wants these kids out. The state and local government want them in. So where are we now? Who's having the upper hand in this sort of like stalemate?
I have to say we've been very lucky in New York City, where the court has been 100% willing to work with legal service providers. They've given rooms to their disposal so that they can screen children. Just last week, we found out that the New York City will be placing representatives from the Department of Education and the Department of Health to provide information within the New York City Immigration Court, which is unheard of up to now. So in New York City, on the ground, we've really been very fortunate, and the judges and the administration of the court has really shown that they want to make sure that these kids' rights are protected and that they have access to the information and the resources that they're entitled to. Around the country, that has not been the case. And we last week, for the first time I'm pretty sure in the history of the juvenile dockets in New York, we saw a few kids actually be ordered deported just for failure to show up, and that was the first time we'd seen that happen. It's a very rare instance.
And in a case like that, what would happen? A kid would be deported?
Because they didn't come to court, oftentimes that, and I'd be remiss in saying that most of these kids are coming to court. In fact, it's the lowest no-show rate that we've ever seen. And most of the times when they don't come to court, it's that they aren't aware that their case was transferred from Texas or wherever they were before to New York City, or they got confused between the date that they have to report to immigration and the date that they have to come to court, which is not always the same thing. And the judges have so far seemed willing to entertain requests to reopen their cases if they can show why they didn't come to court.
Besides those 2 cases, are there anyone being deported? Because I think we're seeing about 130 cases a day.
Mm-hmm. No, so far all the children have had attorneys, and like I said, they qualify for relief, so they're pursuing those applications, or they've been given more time to find lawyers.
What kind of impact is this having on the families here?
I think that's actually a really great question, because on the families, it is so hard on many different levels. In many cases, in about 50% of the cases, it's a parent who's being reunited with their child, right? So of course, there's a sense of guilt on the parent side, maybe for having abandoned the child, abandonment on the child's side for, having been left behind by their parent. Even in the families that do want to make it work, it's just extremely, extremely difficult. They're under this incredible legal pressure to fight their cases in immigration court. They are dealing with mental health issues. I mean, the trauma of the voyage in and of itself, and then of course you add in the reason why they left, the violence that these children witnessed and maybe were subjected to before they left. That's all incredibly difficult. A lot of times these children are being reunited into families where they become a new mouth to feed in families that may not have that kind of resource. And in fact, we're starting to hear about breakdown of some family units and children being kicked out.
We're running out of time, but one question that I want to talk about is what is their claim, the children, when they go into court? Why do they want asylum?
It's not all asylum. A lot of them actually qualify for special immigrant juvenile status, but asylum is based primarily on domestic violence, on gang-based violence, although that is usually a harder claim to win, and on some of them are able to when through trafficking visas. I'm sorry, they're victims of trafficking. And actually, the last time I checked, 5 of them, it turned out were U.S. citizens. So.
Okay. Can you explain this juvenile asylum you were saying?
Special immigrant juvenile status is a case when a child has been, where the reunification is not possible with one or both parents because of abuse, neglect, or abandonment, and it is not in their best interest to return to their country of origin. And if a child can show that they meet those requirements, they can actually get a green card. But it requires a process through family court. The family court is the one that makes that finding that reunification is not possible and that returning them to their country is not possible, which adds obviously a layer of complexity and even more of a need for a lawyer, even though the majority of children qualify for this visa.
Camille Mackler, thanks for shedding some light on this issue for us.
Thank you for having me. It was great being here today.
Thank you. Still to come on the show, a highly controversial immigration policy may actually be failing. Before that, Crystal Lowe has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. Luther Wynn, the president and CEO of Green Track, the largest black-owned casino developer in the country, is looking to bring the success of his casinos to New York State. According to the Amsterdam News, Wynn wants to open the Grand Hudson Casino and Resort in Orange County in New Windsor, New York. The Grand Hudson is expected to bring in more than $181 million annually. The developer plans on getting the license to develop the casino under Governor Cuomo's Upstate New York Gaming Economic Development Act. The legislation establishes 4 destination gaming resorts in upstate New York to boost tourism and economic development in communities across the region. Green Track is the only black-owned casino developer competing for one of 4 of the licenses out of 18 other casino developers vying for the job. The Jewish Daily Forward reports that despite being awarded more than 1,000 seats under the Pre-K for All program, there are still some Jewish leaders who are unhappy with the number of hours of secular instruction mandated by the initiative. They believe that the 6 hours and 20 minutes per day of secular instruction required by the program doesn't allow for religious instruction. The advocates believe that the city's unwillingness to bend on those hours has prevented the Jewish schools from signing up. However, the East Midwood Hebrew Day School actually praises the program. The head of the school, Henry Summers, says they added an extra 20 minutes at the beginning of the school day and 40 minutes at the end of the day to allow time for religious instruction. A book drive to provide migrant children with age and language appropriate books is now entering in its final stages. The book drive is a joint project between the East Harlem bookstore, La Casa Azul, and the Unaccompanied Minor Project at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The bookstore owner, Aurora Anaya Serta, and her longtime friend, Professor Isabel Martinez, felt that they could give back to these children in a different way beyond the basic necessities such as food and clothing. And finally, Galapagos Art Space in Brooklyn recently hosted a showcase for modern and classical Iranian art called Bayan. Bayan means expression in Farsi. Event curator Mohammed Galabi says the showcase was created in response to the great new influx of Iranian artists into New York City. The show's producer, Susan Perrette, says she came up with the idea to do Bayan after doing similar shows for Indian art. The next showcase is scheduled for October 12th. That is from Voices of New York. Those were just a few headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. Independent sources will be back right after this.
Thanks for staying tuned. Secure Communities has been a controversial immigration policy since it was implemented in March 2008. The initiative allows local law enforcement agents to check the immigration status of anyone they have arrested or detained against the FBI's criminal database. When the program was launched, the Obama administration touted it as a way of weeding out the most hardened criminals. But many immigration advocates complain that the policy is also sweeping up immigrants with minor offenses in its dragnet. So, is this policy effective? Dafis Lebrun sat down with NYU Law School professor Adam B. Cox. He recently co-authored a study that showed that Secure Communities was having no effect on curbing crime.
Professor Adam B. Cox, thank you very much for being in studio with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so Professor Cox, let's just start with the obvious question. Why did you and Professor Miles decide to do this study?
The first and most important reason was that when Secure Communities was announced, it was obvious that it was going to be an incredibly ambitious and important part of immigration enforcement. And we were interested in the process by which immigration laws are enforced. And my colleague Tom is very interested in criminal justice issues more generally, and so we wanted to study the impact of this really important policy. And then the second reason was the way in which the policy was rolled out. So when we first read reports of the policy's rollout, we learned that because of technological constraints, the government had to activate the policy around the country in a piecemeal fashion, right? One county at a time, kind of rolling it out over the course of 4 years. And from a social science perspective, that was like a gold mine. You know, when we read those reports, we realized that the most difficult problem you typically face when you're trying to evaluate a government policy is how you untangle the effects of that policy from all the other things that are going on in the world. And this kind of sequential rollout gives you the kind of the gold standard technique to allow you to disentangle the cause and effect that you really care about.
The headline reads, you know, researchers find secure communities doesn't curb crime.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So our primary finding, what we studied was the effect of this program on the major crime categories that are reported by local governments every month to the FBI. So there are 8 of those crimes that get reported every month to the FBI. 4 of them are denoted by the FBI as violent crimes. That's murder, rape, aggravated assault, and robbery, and then 3 property crimes. And so you have motor vehicle theft, burglary, and larceny. And with detailed data on all those crimes, we explored whether the process by which the government goes out, identifies people who have been arrested by local law enforcement, and then arrests them federally in order to place them in removal proceedings. We asked, you know, does locking up all these folks who would otherwise be released back into the community, does it have any effect on those crime rates? And what we discovered is, on the overall index crime rate, sort of the most famous one that gets reported by the FBI, there was no effect on that crime rate. And there was no effect on any of the individual violent crime rates either. When we tested each one separately, murder, rape, aggravated assault, and robbery, there was no effect on those crime rates.
Right. So essentially, and this is to you, does that evidence debunk some of what was used to promote this whole idea of secure communities, that, hey, listen, we're going after the most hardened criminals?
Yeah, we think it does. So there's been a debate about 2 things. First, there's been a debate about what secure communities was actually designed to do. So the government has made somewhat inconsistent statements over time about what it was designed to do, and at times has promoted it principally as a crime fighting tool, and other times has promoted it as a more general means of targeting kind of priority persons for removal, maybe repeat immigration offenders and the like. So one question was, which of these goals is really being pursued? And I think our study, along with some other work we've done, suggests that the program, at least in this initial 4 to 5 year period, is probably more accurately described as a priority removal program than a program that's really targeting just the most serious offenders. The second fight has been over just how good a job the program did do at actually identifying people and screening out just those who'd committed serious offenses. It's difficult for the public to evaluate that, in part because the Department of Homeland Security doesn't make available to the public very detailed information about the criminal history of the people who are removed from these programs. They provide very rough categories. They designate people as level 1 offenders, the most serious category, level 2 or level 3 offenders, which are less serious categories, and then as non-criminal immigration violators, which is a big mouthful that means essentially people have not been convicted of any crimes except civil immigration violations.
Right. So like if they may be here undocumented or something like that.
That's right. And there was a big fight over how serious the criminal histories of people who are in these criminal categories actually was. And it was very hard to observe directly, in part because the information isn't made available by the government. So our study, in a way, kind of cuts through that debate. So instead of having to actually know whether a particular person deported has been convicted of a very, very serious aggravated felony or murder, or instead of a much less serious crime, we just look directly at what the effects on crime are, right? If the government is really doing a good job of deporting very high numbers of very serious offenders, then you would expect to see a decline in these rates of serious crime, and yet we find that there's no decline.
What's the response been to these recent findings?
You know, we've been really excited about the fact that a lot of different organizations have been interested in the work we've been doing. We embarked on the project because as social scientists, we just wanted to better understand this program. But in the wake of the initial coverage of the program by the Times, a lot of other regional papers who are reporting in areas where there's been a lot of controversy about the program have done additional reporting on it. And I know that in various kinds of advocacy efforts around efforts to reform, reshape, or otherwise change secure communities, our findings are getting used, which is exciting.
Did you think that when you started this, that you guys may have been, endeavoring to do something where you may, such as this, like, your work?
I don't know. It was a 4-year process of collecting and analyzing the data associated with this program. When we embarked on the project, we embarked on it with the idea that what we really wanted to do was add to this kind of growing knowledge about this very important long-term question involving immigration and crime. Because concerns about immigrant criminality have really been with us since the dawn of American immigration, and certainly since the early years in which the federal government first started to regulate immigration in the late part of the 19th century. So, for over a century, essentially, we've had a lot of immigration policies that were predicated on the idea that immigrants are more likely to offend than citizens, and that immigration policies can be an effective way to keep communities safe. And so we really started with the thought that we could speak to that debate. And we think our paper does. We think our paper does contribute to that debate. And it's been a nice byproduct that as a result, at the end of the day, it turns out that it also, just because of the way the politics is lined up, right? The president, has ordered the Secretary of Homeland Security to conduct a review of deportation administration over the course of the summer, and everybody seems to assume that there are changes afoot with respect to how the government implements immigration policy. And so it's just the timing has worked out such that our academic study, which was kind of intended for a broader, more historical agenda, happens to be relevant for something that has immediate policy importance, which is gratifying.
Just one more thing. It's another fascinating statistic that was in here. It was the statistic said basically there was about almost 250,000 detentions.
That's right.
Since secure communities began. I want you to put that in perspective for our audience.
So it's a big number, and it's bigger now, right? This is only, our study runs from 2008 to 2012, and we're now in 2014, so there's been even more. Right. But even in the period we studied, during that period, on any given day, there were about 215,000, 220,000 people who were in federal prison. So that's the entire federal prison population for all of the United States. There were more people detained by the government under this one deportation program in that 4-year period that are sitting in federal prison today. So that just gives you some sense that this program, and actually the deportation initiatives under the current administration generally are just sweeping in scale.
Professor Cox, thank you for being in studio with us today. It was a real pleasure meeting you, and good luck with the study.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
When we come back, the link between the hundreds of languages spoken in the city and the subway. Finally, from us, there are more than 800 languages spoken in New York City, making it the most linguistically diverse city in the world. We also have one of the world's largest subway systems, but we don't often talk about the link between the two. CUNY Graduate Center PhD candidate Michelle Johnson is doing just that. She set out to map New York's linguistic diversity by subway line. Dash Henley takes a look at her project in this report.
The Languages Above the Subway project was my capstone project for the Interactive Technology and Pedagogy program. because I wanted to see how those languages were distributed throughout the city, who's speaking what language above the train. So what language are you stepping off the train into? I came to New York because it's the most linguistically diverse place, probably in the world. People come with all of this experience and all of this linguistic knowledge. And there's languages spoken here that die here. They're spoken nowhere else in the world. The subway system, in a lot of ways, defines a geography that the city has. So I wanted to line languages up to that as opposed to just the actual physical space. And then that'll take you to a whole page of graphs that shows what language is spoken along which line. If you're most interested in seeing it by subway line, you can always click on whichever line you're most interested in. So you click on the 7 and it'll take you to a page that has all of the languages listed. If you then hover over the dots that are there, it'll show you the percentage of speakers at each station. The data that I used to create the project was the 2010 US Census. So this is all freely available information, and there's lots of graphs of New York City, of language concentrations throughout the city. The patterns that I detected on this map are that the ends of the lines become considerably more interesting than the middle of the line. The middle of the line tends to be a lot of English speakers, a lot of Spanish speakers. The languages were concentrated, and there'd be multilingual communities at the end of the line. What I see happening is that there's, a lot of English in the middle, and then the English just falls right off at either end, and all of the other languages start coming up. Even though there's a pretty obvious concentrations like Russian out in Brighton Beach, it is almost exclusively Russian speakers. But there's still concentrations of at least 5% of Hebrew, of Haitian Creole at those ends, which has been really interesting as well. Just how people settle and how people create their communities. Bay Ridge is really an interesting neighborhood in terms of my languages project. The only way to get to Bay Ridge is by taking the R all the way to the end. And the R train is the most linguistically diverse train throughout the city. So there's more languages spoken along the R than any other place. Because once you get down here, we have an Arabic-speaking population, as you can see from some of the signs around. There's Spanish speaking just to the north of here, as well as Chinese just to the north and the east. This particular neighborhood is really exemplary of New York and all of the languages coming together. It was originally settled by Norwegians, and then there was a Italian immigrant community, a Greek immigrant community, and you still see traces of that even today. So there's Arabic, Greek, Italian, Spanish, and Chinese all right here. And that's what you can see from this project, is that the end of the R line is fascinating because there's speakers of everything at the end of this particular train. I hope that either I or someone else can take this project as a starting point and really look at it over generations. Like every 10 years or every 20 years, how has it changed? Have the percentages changed at each station? Have different linguistic groups moved up a line or down a line? Have different linguistic groups become more prominent or less prominent throughout the years? I think would give a really interesting picture of how language travels along the subway lines as well.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.